Hello there everybody, my name is Bloomer Brown and welcome to episode 6 of Kerbal Space Program Retrograde, where we are jumping straight into a flight test of some brand new hardware in the form of our first 2.5 meter launcher. Now while the thrust to weight ratio at launch is a little bit lacking, and in retrospect I should probably have waited just a little longer before staging my launch clamps, you can see that we are more than capable of lifting off and beginning our rather slow trip up to low carbon orbit. Now while I have unlocked some of the 2.5 meter parts, I have yet to unlock the epic power of the mighty mainsail, and so I've turned once again to the guys over at KW Rocketry, who are providing us with more of their Wildcat engines that I've been using on the 1.25 meter launcher, and I've basically just clustered 5 of them on the bottom of the first stage, and I have to say that I really love the sound of those things as they light up and start firing, and I'm sure that any spectators watching from the shores and maybe watching on TV at home are going to be equally impressed by this. Full props to KW Rocketry for getting some awesome engine sounds in there. So on with the mission, I suppose. So during the week, myself and Werner von Kerman have been doing some simulations and crunching the numbers, and I feel that this is probably going to be a fairly okay flight. Of course, by simulations and crunching the numbers, I mean flying this and reverting it, and doing a little bit of tweaking here and there. And so rather than slapping a dummy payload on this, I've decided to put some mission critical hardware inside that egg-shaped shroud, which is it's actually made up of some various interstages and parts from KW Rocketry and B9, because I don't have the 2.5 meter fairings unlocked yet either. As for what's inside, well, I'm going to keep that quiet for now, but I'm guessing that as the episode moves on, you will probably be able to guess what is actually inside it. So making our way up, our gravity turn is coming along nicely, and we drop that first stage, which flies back at incredible speed, powered off by those Sepatrons just to give ourselves a little bit of clearance. And our second stage seems to be firing quite well. One of the engines that we do have unlocked in the 2.5 meter range is of course the Skipper liquid fuel engine, which is going to drive us up onto a suborbital flight and kick us into a nice orbit once we get up there. There may in fact be enough fuel left over to begin our burn out towards the moon. But I suppose that remains to be seen, and since this is all post-commentary and I recorded this a little while ago, I am not entirely sure how much fuel is going to be left in that stage. And lastly, we come to the self-contained low-profile engine that is mounted on the bottom of that fairing. In fact, it doesn't almost looks as if there is no engine there, but there is one of those low-profile engines from KW Rocketry. I think it performs pretty much, well, at least in terms of ISP, it performs pretty much the same as the LV909, or is the LV303? I can never remember what that is. Perhaps this is the LV303 and the other one is the LV909. At any rate, it is a low-profile engine designed for landers, and you can probably make out as the footage goes along there that I have got some landing gear installed onto that particular stage. And so we make it into orbit, and I decide to make it burn out to the moon. There is no sense in wasting any time, just tweaking it around there, and I'm probably going to leave correcting my inclination until I am a little bit further out, and where it will cost us a hell of a lot less in terms of delta V. I think I actually end up deleting the maneuver node there. I am assuming that I am going to just wait for moonrise and point and burn. Incidentally, we have plenty of electric charge aboard this. We're up to 860 there. So even as we pass behind the moon, things shouldn't get too bad. And yet just turning the rocket to face, incidentally, along my radial vector. But what I'm looking for is actually to face the moon so that I can get a handle on when it is about to rise. Just adjusting the camera so that I can spot it coming over the horizon. It often sneaks over the horizon before I have had time to react to it. And so we just point ourselves prograde at this stage and light up the engine and begin our burn out towards the moon, running out of fuel after a very short time. We have almost 2,000 meters per second on this landing stage, and so it seems that this is going to that's more than enough actually to complete a circularization out at the moon and bring ourselves in for a landing. Probably not enough to take off and come back, but that is not going to be the destiny of this spacecraft. It is going to the moon and it is going to stay there. We do have a little bit of inclination correction to make. And as we make our way out from behind the shadow of Kerbal, the sun is going to illuminate this really egg-shaped spacecraft, and we might get a decent look at that low-profile engine. Though I think I am actually spending more time setting up my maneuvers than I am getting beauty shots of this at the moment. I set up a maneuver node to correct my inclination and also make sure that my periapsis is going to be something reasonable as I come in over the surface of the moon. So just getting myself pointed there, and we're getting a good look at this. It actually seems so slim and tiny compared to that fairing. It almost looks incidentally, it doesn't really matter if I tip this over on landing, but it would be nice to get it to actually touch down on those landing legs. But we'll see how we get on when we get out there. And so zipping forward, we begin correcting our inclination around the moon. I delete the maneuver node part of the way through. I was mostly just using that as something to point towards. And I begin plotting out my circularization maneuver around the moon. I want to get this as circular as possible because it just means that things are a little bit easier when it comes to landing. You know, the difference between having an eccentric orbit and a circular orbit, and they were getting a lovely look at that engine. Absolutely beautiful model. The difference, I suppose, between aiming for something of a more circular, perfect circular orbit as opposed to something a little more eccentric is that you can kind of pick where you are going to do your deceleration burns, because if your orbit, if the difference between your apoapsis and periapsis isn't that great, well, it's not so critical to burn at periapsis to get your efficiency because, well, most of your orbit is at about the same height, and so you don't have to worry about expending more delta V by not burning at periapsis if your orbit is less eccentric. Anyway, we get into our maneuver node, and I actually run past it just a little bit, but that's not a problem. We light up the engine and begin burning down, getting ourselves into a nice circular orbit and actually overcooking it just a little bit. So I make a burn a little bit later to correct that. Again, wasting some precious fuel. Not entirely sure what the delta V was showing up on that there. Just around to apoapsis and make a tiny little correction to bring ourselves into a proper circular orbit. So at this stage, it would seem that the crater I am intending to target, I think it's called the Northwest Crater, is unfortunately on the night side of the moon, and so I decide to leave this in orbit and wait for the moon to move into the right position and go off and do something else in the meantime. And by doing something else, I of course mean launching more rockets. So we are moving into phase 2 of our mission to the moon by sending up our first crew member, Valentina Kerman, aboard the very capable 1.25 meter launcher. And barring any staging issues, we should be able to get her into a nice circular orbit around Kerbal and make an injection for the moon. Now, much like the Kerbal probe, she is going to be putting herself into a polar orbit around the moon. If you remember in the last episode, we had Bill Kerman out in polar orbit of Kerbal gathering up the crew reports from space, and I said that was sort of a test of concept and a practice run, I suppose, for this mission. And so yeah, Valentina is going to be tasked with gathering all of the EVA reports from space above the various biomes of the moon, because there is quite a lot of science to be gained from doing this, and I've basically chosen to send her out separately. The plan being that once she has her mission completed, she is probably going to make a descent to the surface and join up with the rest of the crew that will be carrying out the ground surveys. So you can see me setting myself up a maneuver there and struggling with it quite a bit. But eventually I think I get the encounter that I want and begin pointing my nose towards it, this time using the nav ball in the cockpit, because I've been launching quite a few missions, and yeah, I like to spice things up a little bit from time to time. So yeah, we begin coming around to our maneuver and we start making our burn. Incidentally, still working on the upper stage of the launch vehicle, which I think has a slightly reduced fuel tank from when we first launched it. I'm going to have to come up with a name for this launcher. I was thinking something along the lines of the Frodock Kerman launcher, and then perhaps naming the rescue pod Experience, which would of course give us the beautiful naming scheme of launching the Frodock Kerman Experience. However, that is to be yet decided. So yeah, I begin plotting a maneuver that will send us into a polar orbit, and much like the Kerbal probe, we are unfortunately going to be dipping down behind the far side of the moon, or at the dark side of the moon. So yeah, getting a quick look at the spacecraft that Valentina is riding out here towards the moon, already attempting to grab some science, although I think Jebediah actually grabbed the high above Kerbal science. So while Valentina is making her way out, we jump back to the launch pad again, with the 2.5 meter launcher carrying yet another payload out to the moon. We are most definitely moonward bound in this episode, and that is an absolutely incredible screenshot of our rocket launching up there. So this is going to be carrying a laboratory out to the moon. If you remember, in one of the earlier episodes, we were looking at designing a massive rover that would carry a laboratory and a suite of experiments out to the surface. And I decided to abandon plans to develop that. Firstly, because it would be a heavy launch to carry out, and secondly, the stability of that rover, which I've called the over rover, for its propensity to flip over. And I thought it would be a little bit dangerous to try and send that out to the moon and have it flip over and potentially damage our laboratory or leave ourselves compromised in gathering our science and having us return early to Kerbal without doing all of the science that we wanted to do. So yeah, we are going to pop down a stationary lab, and I suppose this launch kind of goes a ways to demystifying what may be in the egg-shaped fairing that is already in orbit around the moon. And so, we begin completing our orbital insertion, and I notice that the moon is actually about to rise, and so I continue making my burn out towards it. And we do manage to get an encounter and start working that down. I am going to be leaving this in orbit for a little while, until of course the sun rises over the crater that I am targeting, and I am once again using Kerbal Alarm Clock to set everything up there. And we can jump back now to Valentina Kerman, who is actually just entering the SOI of the moon, and begin plotting her circularization burn, which I am leaving a little bit eccentric for now. I may want to change the plane of my orbit just a little bit so that I am picking up the sunlight. And since we are over the moon, it is time, of course, to start doing some science before we start getting low over the moon. And as Valentina steps out, she is mysteriously thrown away from the spacecraft and scrambles to gain control as Kerbal Alarm Clock fires up an alarm telling me something, but I don't have time to deal with that. I have to get Valentina back aboard the spacecraft. What I think is happening is that to make this look the part, to make this launcher look the part, I popped an aerodynamic nose cone on there, and I think that as she exits the spacecraft, she is actually catching her rather large helmet on it, and it continuously throws her out into space when she goes on EVA. In fact, it would probably have been better if I had popped a parachute down on that, because if things go wrong with the rest of the mission and there is no return vehicle sitting for her on the surface of the moon, it may be a case that she will have to make the return to Kerbin using this particular spacecraft as opposed to trying to land it on the surface, and a parachute would be useful then. Although we do have a very capable rescue pod which would no doubt be able to pluck her from orbit, and perhaps even we could manage to do a propulsive landing on the surface if things went wrong. But for now, you see me very carefully working Valentina back towards the ladder with the RCS pack. And ever so slowly and ever so carefully we make our way in and manage to grab the ladder and board the spacecraft with the all-important EVA report. And so it is now past time for us to do our circularization. I think that is actually what the Kerbal alarm was all about, and so I just point myself roughly retrograde and start to throttle up the engines. And we eventually make it into orbit, and I begin getting Valentina out once again, having the same issue of her being thrown away from the spacecraft. And this does become a little bit of a game until a little while into doing these crew reports that I discover by angling her spacecraft ever so slightly in a particular orientation, she can actually embark and disembark without having too many issues. And as we are sorting out Valentina Kerman's orbit and deciding whether or not to get her along the day-night terminator, which ultimately I do decide to do, Kerbal Alarm Clock tells us that it is time to pay attention to our laboratory, because it is at last reaching periapsis and it is time to pay attention to it. And so I begin chasing down my maneuver that is going to put me into a nice circular orbit around the moon. You can actually notice there that some of the inclinations are slightly out, and we just jump back to Valentina, and I think I have a maneuver set up to begin circularizing this orbit, but I just decide to fly this manually, getting myself to apoapsis and bringing my periapsis in a little bit closer, and working my way back up to get myself circularized around the poles along the Day-Night Terminator. In this case, I am actually targeting a relatively 90-degree orbit because I want to make sure that I pass over the poles and grab the sides, even though the pole biome is pretty big and even a little bit of inclination off the 90-degree mark wouldn't really affect us getting that. I still want to kind of try and do it properly. Just even if it is a case of showing that I actually can do it and that I was just being lazy with the Kethane probe. So yeah, we managed to circularize Valentina around the poles, and I think that I may have burned just a touch too much, and so just trying to cancel out any eccentricity there. And we get Valentina out once again, and she starts doing her space acrobatics high over the poles of the moon, grabbing her crew reports. And this is all sped up footage because it is quite a tedious thing to be bringing her back to the spacecraft every time. And tilting it at a slight angle does seem to help her in getting in and out. Incidentally, just using a Kerbal flight engineer there in order to make sure that I grab each and every biome as I pass over it. And so I sit with this for a little while, letting the time pass until once again the sun illuminates the northwest crater, where we are planning to conduct our missions. Now, in order to fly over it, I have to make a slight inclination change, about 90 degrees ahead of it in my orbit. I could of course do it 90 degrees behind it in my orbit too. I also do a little bit of retro burning there because of course that inclination change does kick up my orbit ever so slightly. And so it's just a little over 100 meters per second, and you can see me chasing down the maneuver node there a little bit because I did burn a little bit late, and just correcting my periapsis there again, and plotting out a maneuver which is going to bring me low over the crater, and also setting up a second maneuver node there just to act sort of as a timing beacon for when I should be passing over roughly the center of the crater. So I've decided to drop this mystery egg fairing down onto the surface ahead of the lab just to get an idea about how easy it is going to be to drop the lab down. That is a very critical piece of hardware to get onto the ground, and because of the nature of what's in this fairing, I am not too worried if I don't get it down exactly where I would like it. You can see me there checking the delta V and getting a little bit nervous as we pass into the shadow of the moon. Limited at this time to only 10 times time acceleration, and you can see me adjusting the camera there to watch the Kerbal rise, which is about to happen. And I notice as I'm coming over that we are of course going to pass over the far side crater and perhaps get a look at the lunar probe, although it's unlikely that we will be able to see it since it is on the dark side of the moon. And the our instruments begin picking up the transponder signal that it is sending out, and we fly over a little bit over 20 kilometers away. I always am fascinated watching things like that, particularly if you are on EVA and you get to see one of your satellites transit in the skies above. As the sun rises, that signals that we are approaching our target, and I begin plotting a maneuver that is going to bring me down onto the surface, and I decide that I want to see just how much I can steer myself towards. The ideal landing site is somewhere to the northeast side of the crater, though I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to be able to get the lab down there. So anyway, I deploy the landing gear and get ready to start making my burn for descent, and light up the engines just a little bit early so that we kind of split it across the maneuver node. Incidentally, this is quite an aggressive burn, and it leaves me with quite a tight margin on my delta V, though I should in theory be able to land on the surface. Though for some reason I decide that this is as good a place as any, and decide to start nulling out my horizontal speed and just bring this thing straight down in the center of the crater. So yeah, just working along there, and I tip myself up. Now, as I said earlier, I'm actually not sure that I can land this in the upright position, and in order to deploy, for the Kerbals to deploy its content successfully, it does need to be on its side, which is less than ideal. So I am not too worried that we are making our way down towards a 10.5 degree slope, which will more than likely flip this thing over, because that is kind of a standard operating procedure. So with about 20 something seconds there, I am getting a little bit nervous as to how fast the ground is coming up, and so with 20 seconds left I start to kill off my velocity, and I think at any moment now I'm about to drop out of time accelerated footage and bring you the landing proper. So yeah, we are moving down quite slowly, or at least it seems that we're moving down slowly. We're actually approaching 80 meters per second, with only about 500 meters to go until the surface, and so I start using my thrust to slow down, bringing my delta V down ever so slightly. We have just a little over 3 seconds worth of burn left, though we are, and I think that we are still moving a little bit too fast, so it is questionable as to whether we can make the landing without actually breaking anything. And with 4 meters per second left and a velocity of 7 meters per second in the vertical direction, we are going to be cutting things quite tight on this landing indeed. And so as I hit the ground, I throttle up and burn off the last of my fuel, and immediately start tipping over and using the reaction wheels that are inside to try and cushion it as I bring it down. Now, as I say, landing this vertically was going to be a challenge, because the center of mass is quite high up, and I would have to flip it over onto its side anyway in order to deploy it, but I would rather it was in a slightly more controlled fashion. And of course, because we're on a slope, the next risk, of course, is that we are going to start sliding or rolling down there. We've already seen the parts taking some strain there, in particular the nose cone, and so I spent a little bit of time fiddling around with the controls and the reaction wheels to try and stabilize this thing on the surface, and kind of angle myself nose uphill so that I am less likely to begin sliding. And yeah, there we have it, at long last, settled and safe on the surface. Not in the ideal location, because we are roughly situated in the center of this crater, where I would rather be slightly further to the northeast, because that of course gives me access to some extra biomes up there. But anyway, yeah, our mystery craft, our mystery lander is on the surface, and with the episode running just a little bit longer than I would like, I think that I am going to take this opportunity to say thank you very much for tuning in. You have been watching Bloomer Brown on YouTube, and I will see you next time.